college counseling here at McQuaid Jesuit. And tonight is the first of 4 consecutive nights where we'll have a total of 10 different presentations on a wide array of topics pertaining to the college admissions process. So our second presenter tonight is coming from Brunswick, Maine. Emily Almas is the Director of Admissions at Bowdoin College, which happens to be the alumni, the alumni of or the graduating school of our principal here, Adam Baber, who's a proud alumni of Bowdoin, as I was trying to say. So Emily, thank you so much for joining us. Emily's presentation tonight is Understanding Highly Selective College Admissions. And I warned Emily earlier that she's coming from the New England area, presenting virtually in upstate New York on the evening when the Bills and Patriots are playing. So fortunate for her, she's doing this remotely instead of in person. We will, for all of you Bills fans out there, have a hard stop at 8:15, so you can turn us off and turn on the Bills game. So Emily, thank you in advance for giving so freely of your time. Looking forward for your presentation, and I'll turn it over to you. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I am just thrilled to be speaking with you, all of the students and families out there, and just want to say thank you for the invitation to talk on this subject, as well as thank you for giving up your Monday evening, especially with that Pats Bills game ahead of you. I won't tell you who I'm cheering for, although it might be a little obvious that I'm coming to you from Maine in the Pats backyard. So I know there's lots to enjoy and watch there in upstate New York tonight as well. We're going to talk this evening about holistic admissions processes in the context of highly selective colleges and universities. And if you joined for the prior session, some of this content might sound familiar to you, but we'll delve a little bit more deeply into what colleges and universities generally are looking for, especially those that have very broad and deep applicant pools. And I want to mention on that note that I'm speaking generally here. So certainly I'll use examples from Bowdoin, and I'll talk about other institutions where I've worked, a variety of different kinds of colleges and universities, but we will be speaking in generalities. One of the things I would like to elevate and highlight is the importance of match. It's not just what you, the student, or you, the parent of a young person, are seeking, it's what colleges and universities are seeking as well. And how the applicant presentation in the application process can help go a long way in demonstrating why you might be a good match for a particular institution. We'll talk about some tips for how you can do that, why your writing matters. And then, of course, if you have any questions in the time allowed, I'd be happy to answer them too. So I want to start with this quotation by a college counselor named Frank Sachs. He's involved in the college admissions profession for many years, works at an independent school in Minnesota. And he's attributed with saying, college admissions is a match to be made, not a prize to be won. And I'm starting this presentation with this quotation because I think it's important for us to recognize that within the world of highly selective college admissions, so those are colleges and universities that are admitting, say, a third or fewer of their students, what outcome a student receives is not a reflection on who they are in terms of their worth or their value as a human being. What it really reflects is what a college or university is seeking. And each college or university is seeking something different, very contextual, very driven by that year, that applicant pool, the priorities of that campus, and that's going to change. So just a friendly reminder as you go into this process, whether you or your child, your son is a senior, or whether you're coming at this with a high school freshman, that the college outcome that you receive is not a reflection of their accomplishments, but really what an institution is seeking as well. So what do admissions committees typically do, and how does this play a role in the outcomes you might find at a highly selective college or university? The first thing that we often do, again, speaking generally here, is we're creating a class that is well-rounded, the class of students themselves, not a class of necessarily well-rounded individual students. And I think this is an important distinction because sometimes students may feel that they have to sort of go through an imaginary list list of things to check off. Were they captain of enough teams or president of enough clubs, or did they have a certain kind of transcript as a criterion for admission? And we're building classes of people, groups, communities. We're not necessarily looking for all of those skills or talents or attributes within each individual applicant. Admissions committees are typically completing holistic reviews of applications. So we're looking at all of the different pieces of who an applicant is and what they're presenting to the college. And we'll delve a little bit more deeply into that in just a minute. But we're also going beyond just what a transcript says or a topic or a list of activities. We're trying to get an understanding of who is this young person? What are they interested in? What will they bring to our campus? How does that fit with what we are building on our campus in terms of community? And how can we admit this group of people together to have this wonderful experience while they're at our college or university? We're also thinking about diversity in many different forms. We want folks from many different places and perspectives and backgrounds, different academic areas of interests. There's lots of different ways that it's important we have a broad and diverse community on our campus. And all of this comes together to really define a sense of match between an applicant and a specific institution. This is why different colleges and universities come to different outcomes on an application. Sometimes I'll hear from students or families, oh, well, if so-and-so got admitted to X school, they should by its very nature be admitted to Y school. It's 2% more, or less selective or something of that nature. And that's not how this works, right? Every school is driven by its own unique needs as they build that class. So where do we get a sense of all of these different pieces to a student that I've been talking about? How a student applies, whether it's the common application, whether it's through an institution's own specific application. Every school is a bit different in what they offer and what applications they accept. There's several different pieces that we'll see. First, of course, is the personal information. Who is this young person? The academic record, so the transcript, what courses has a student elected to take, how have they done in those classes, where have they pursued challenge, where have they gone more in depth if there's an area of specific interest to them. We'll look at their writing. So how does this young man write about his experiences? What does he tell us about himself? How does he present himself in the application? What does he do outside of the classroom? Maybe it's in the community, maybe it's at school, maybe there are other commitments in his life with family. What is he doing when he's not in class? We'll spend a lot of time digging into those letters of recommendation. What do teachers say about him? What about your school counselor? What is that letter saying about who a young person is? And then many colleges, universities, but not all, welcome or even accept additional materials. So that might be an optional interview if offered. Not all institutions do. It might be a video response or a supplemental essay or an art supplement. There are many different ways different colleges and universities solicit additional information, but those pieces are just as valuable to our process. So you may be thinking, okay, in the admissions process, you're looking at the transcript, you're understanding who a young person is, what they've accomplished, and how they might fit. But what does that mean? What are the factors beyond perhaps the more obvious factors in the selection process? And this is where every institution, every college, and every university that has to make these difficult decisions among many qualified students, that's where these questions come into play. So some of the kinds of questions that an admissions committee may ask, again, it's going to vary by institution, include things like, how does this person share himself in the application process? What do we learn about who this person is and how they might contribute to the community that we're building? What is that community and what are we seeking? What are their interests and their personal attributes and their strengths, their skills, their talents? And what are we as a college hoping to have on our campus? What does that look like? And how do those things align? Does this student have interests or talents that are aligned with even what we offer or what we're hoping to offer, what we're growing on our campus? what kind of classmate might they be, or roommate, or teammate, lab partner? Can we get a sense of that in the application, and what do we know about that? Why is the student attracted to our institution? What is it about our campus that they have identified as a good match for him? And then every institution, every college and every university, but particularly with highly selective institutions where there's a really broad applicant pool and more applicants than we have space on our campus, how do we identify if there are other components at play in our decision-making process? So at Bowdoin, students are admitted to the college. They don't apply to a specific major or division, but I've also worked at other institutions where they do. So does a school admit students by major or just, to a specific division or school? And what are the capacity and other constraints on that process? A college might be growing a particular program or starting a new program or hoping to expand an area of campus. Is this student aligned with those needs? Are there particular skills or identities that are important to us? Some schools may have specific geographic areas they're hoping to grow in terms of their campus population. International students, for example, or maybe they're seeking students who have a particular identity in some way, a religious affiliation, for example. There are lots of different ways that different colleges and universities are parsing through applicants in our our admissions process and hoping to build this community that best serves that campus and that school. And that's in part why you see different outcomes when it comes to admissions, because every school is looking for something slightly different in making that match. And so you might be wondering, well, how do I know what a specific institution is looking for? And how does that figure into my search process or your son's search process? I took some screenshots earlier from 3 different institutions. Coincidentally, they happen to be institutions where I've worked. So in the bottom right, you'll see a snapshot from our page here at Bowdoin College about what we're looking for. To the left, you'll see a snapshot from the website of Swarthmore College, where I was director of recruitment previously. And then at the top, you'll see a snapshot from Washington University in St. Louis, where I was most recently also director of admissions. And I included these as 3 of many, but examples of where you might find more information on a specific college or university's website about the kinds of students they're seeking or the kinds of attributes that they're looking for in their admissions process beyond a stellar academic record or a rigorous academic preparation. The other thing I would mention here is you have fantastic college counseling there, McQuaid. And so I would lean into the wonderful counselors in Mr. Seraphine's office who provide great guidance and support about identifying a college list and thinking about institutions that might be a really good match for you or your child in this process. But this can be a great way, a website, other sources of information to get a handle on what specifically is this highly selective college or university seeking. And then sometimes when I suggest this to students and families, they ask, okay, so then is the challenge to present oneself as that particular profile of what a school says they're looking for? And I would argue that's not the right tactic. Instead, I would suggest that the right approach is for a young person to be himself and to think about how to best convey himself in the admissions process, because that's the most effective way, I think, of sharing with admissions committees who are making these nuanced decisions among many thousands, frankly, of applicants with finite space available. And one of the best ways to do that, I argue, is for young people to think about how their writing presents who they are throughout the application. So certainly the first component would be, I think, a student's demonstration of their academic potential and preparation. And that's largely through the transcript, which a student does not need to worry about formatting or writing or preparing. McQuaid will do that for you. Certainly academic achievement being important and reflected there. But beyond that, the way a young man presents himself, I think, can really tell a story that helps an admissions committee understand him and why he might be a good match. Some schools offer interviews. That's great. We do offer them here at Bowdoin. Other institutions I've been don't offer them at all. And so I think it's really up to the student to decide whether they are or can take advantage of that. But the writing in an application and how a student presents himself, I think, is really the piece that helps in the selective college admissions process for a student to come through. Admissions committees, we really want to get to know you, the applicant, or you, your child, in this process. And that is what we aim to do. That is why from November through March, we spend countless hours every day and weekend, nighttime, reading applications and getting to know students and having great conversations, because that is our goal. And so let's spend a little bit of time talking about how a young person might convey themselves best in that process. Thinking about that writing, thinking about that application. The first sort of piece, I think, is proficient writing skills, and your child or you, the student, have a leg up in this position because you go to a school that teaches great writing skills and has rigorous opportunities to explore writing. But it's important to think about how your writing skills come through. Are you using good mechanics? Is the writing complete and coherent? Are you using appropriate vocabulary and syntax? All good questions to ask oneself. The second piece is good judgment. So again, helping the admissions committee, the admissions officer who's evaluating your application, understand who you are and what you bring to the table, as well as that you have a sense of judgment in your application. And then lastly, your perspective. What's important to you, who you are, what are the attributes and characteristics that make you, you, or your child, how do you get this across in the application? So your writing is a great place for us to understand you and who you are. And your writing comes through, your son's writing comes through in many different places. I think students oftentimes think that their personal statement or their essay is the one place where writing is assessed, but the entirety of the application is an opportunity for the student to demonstrate these facets of their application. And so that includes information like their personal demographic information, their activities, short answers, how they communicate with offices of admission. There's lots of different places that students' writing and self-presentation plays a role. So let's turn our attention to activities for a moment and sort of talk through what this might look like and ideas or suggestions, just an idea of what you might think about or consider as a prospective applicant. So in the activities section of an application, and I'm speaking generally here, of course, about all of the material tonight, but speaking about the common application just in general, we learn what a student does outside the classroom. So do they have family responsibilities or commitments? What are their interests? What do they like to do for fun? What do they do because they're helping a community or having an impact on our community? These are all places that we learn more about a student. There's no right or wrong list or activities. I just want to point that out, that hopefully is obvious, but bears repeating. But it's more than just a list of how a student spends their time. It's an opportunity for him to share with us not only their writing skills, but their perspective, their values, their interests. I will note that each of these sections in the activity component of the application is limited by character counts. So keep that in mind as you're completing the application or thinking about it. But let's take an example and let's look here at one activity reported by one student and 3 different ways the student could share this information with us. Keep in mind, same activity, same time commitment, same item we are trying to represent here, but it's represented in 3 different ways. So the first example, you can see that the student has a typo, right? Or not necessarily a typo. I'd call it a typo. The word class sort of is strangely capitalized here. There's no description of what the student has done. Limited information to help us as an admissions committee understand what this commitment means to the student. Excuse me. In the second example, we have a little bit more information. We understand a little bit more about what the student has done. They were part of the student voice committee. They were voted class representative. So we're getting more detail and more understanding here. And then in the third example, we have even more detail. So this student was elected by their peers. They attended weekly meetings. They brought greater awareness and inclusion within their school. Again, this example is not designed to show one example listed 3 times, but this is to sort of spark some thinking among you or your son about how they represent what they do, whether at school or in the community or in other places, and how they represent themselves in the application process when you're thinking about highly selective college admissions. Let's look at one more example. So this student is talking about a summer work position they had at a grocery store. And you can see there's 3 different ways that a student has presented this example students have presented this information. One provides more limited information. One provides more information that's helpful detail. But the third example here, I would argue, helps us understand, the admissions committee understand what the student did, what the outcomes were, and why a little bit of personality here, right? So the student got to sleep 10 extra minutes so they have, because they don't have to walk to school. So hopefully this is a helpful example of how a student can present themselves in the college admissions process. To be clear, in ways that are totally accurate and fair representations of who they are, but helps an admissions committee better understand who they are and what they're interested in and what impact or accomplishments they may have had in whatever realm that they're sharing. I'll also take just a few minutes to talk about the personal statement or the essay and why it's important and how it's another venue for students to convey more information about themselves to the admissions committee when we're having to make these tough decisions, given the finite amount of space we have in our classes and on our campuses. So it's an opportunity for applicants to really talk to application reviewers and to learn more about a student. It's the place where students have the most voice in the process. Formatting doesn't always carry over. Just a pro tip for students who write their essays in things like Word and then copy and paste. You always want to check that on the application. But it's not just an opportunity to showcase your writing skills. It's also an opportunity for a person to show us what's important to oneself, as well as more about the characteristics and interests of a specific student. I always encourage students to choose a prompt that resonates with him, not one that they think or he thinks we as admissions counselors want to see. That's really important. And I think a forced essay can come across exactly as that, forced. So encourage students to pick the prompt that most speaks to them. And on that note, there is a prompt where students can write their own topic. So functionally, any topic is on the table. It's always great to learn more about a specific student as opposed to that student's relative or friend or whomever else. So really encourage students to think about how his own experience is reflected in the essay rather than somebody else's story, although those can be great to hear more about. No, they don't always help us understand the student in the application. The present is a great place to focus as opposed to the past or the future. Certainly anecdotes or stories or narratives about experiences from the past can be useful, and I've seen many well done essays in that vein. But it can be also helpful to keep in mind, what does that narrative or story tell about the student today, especially for narratives that speak to many years ago. So a story about an applicant when they were in first grade, it could be a good example, but you have to make sure as an applicant that it is. Showing and not telling is always great. So show us why or what you're saying or demonstrating. Don't just tell us. And then the power of proofreading and editing, always just want to highlight that in this process. Different institutions may have different supplemental essays. They may be optional, they may be required, or they may not be part of the process at all. So this is going to vary depending on college or university. But for those that do offer them, they can be a great way for an applicant to demonstrate a sense of match with that institution. And oftentimes, at least in my experience at different colleges and universities, these are places where admissions committees really lean in when making decisions between applicants to understand, why is this student a good match for this specific school? A few tips in that vein, thinking about the topic tonight. The first is, it's really important to answer the prompt. So if a school is asking a student, why are you specifically interested in X major or why college, be sure to answer that question, and not just a general sort of multi-purpose essay that you're using for many different applications. On that note, if you were using an essay or pieces of an essay for multiple applications, be sure to change the school name, and to think about, does my essay, if it is so multi-purpose, really serve the prompt well, if I can use it for so many different institutions or kinds of institutions? And then also, make sure to pay attention to what's required versus what's optional. If schools say, and this has been my experience at 4 different institutions now, if schools say that something is optional, it's truly optional. I have faith in our profession to be transparent about what's optional and what's required, but it can be a really great opportunity if you feel a strong alignment with a particular institution to use the optional to demonstrate that. So take advantage of those opportunities where and when you can. I'll give you a few examples just here from Bowdoin, but every college or university that has a supplement or an optional supplement may have a different question. We ask students a few questions. One is, how did you learn about us? Again, no right or wrong answer. We're just interested in knowing more. Then we ask students to select one of a line from something we call the offer of the college, and optionally tell us more about why it resonates with them. So this is a good example for students that want to share more about why they've identified Bowdoin as a specific place for them, to give us more information. And then nearly all colleges and universities that I know of allow for students to share additional information if they need to provide more details about something in their application. So you can take advantage of that as well. If you have questions about sharing additional information, it's certainly not required or expected. Talk to your school counselor, or have your son talk to his school counselor about what might be appropriate for him. I do want to just make a plug for thinking about writing and self-presentation comprehensively, and not just in the writing sections on the Common Application or the Coalition application, and suggest email correspondence can be another place where a student can think about how they engage, demonstrate their writing skills, and really, frankly, make an impression. And by no means is email correspondence expected in the admissions process, but it is something that I think I've noticed over the years and just wanted to mention tonight to all of you. So if you're reaching out to a college or university, let's say you have questions or you want to know more about something, you can absolutely do that. Every college or university I know of has an email address on their admissions website. They also often have the contact information for admissions officers or different staff members on that site. You can typically find the contact information for the admissions person for upstate New York, for example, on their website. And you can reach out to that person with questions you might have or to learn more. But when you're doing that, keep in mind some good questions. The first is, are you reaching the right person? Is the question appropriate to the audience? Have you done adequate research to make sure that the question you're asking isn't easily answered right on the front page of the website? And of course, how does your message sound in context? So let's look at some examples that are basically real life, but have been slightly modified for this evening. So the first example, hi, and there's some grammar issues here, but I'm just going to read it, right? Hi, I'm very interested in your school. Do you offer virtual interviews? If so, how do I sign up? Also, can you please tell me a bit more about the school? Thanks, right? So that's one example. This is an example email. And think about this email in comparison to this email. So they're using dear and the formal name of the person they're reaching out to. They're introducing themselves. They're using complete sentences and correct grammar and punctuation. They're explaining why they're reaching out and what information that they need. And it's a very professional, engaging way to interact with an admissions person. So just to put a little bug in your ear as a prospective student or as a parent of a prospective student, thinking about the ways you present yourself comprehensively throughout the process. So wrapping up and pulling all this information together before I turn it over to some questions, hopefully you have some. I just want to sort of reiterate and bring home the point that you can do it, or your son can do it. Being authentic and genuine and pursuing the activities or courses or experiences that reflect one's own actual interests and who one is at this point in time is the best way to be yourself in this process and to find an institution that's the right match for what you're seeking and is seeking someone like you. It's okay if your interests grow and change as you develop as a young person, as you go through high school, or ultimately as you go through college. But rather than presenting oneself in some way that aligns with what you think a highly selective college or university is seeking, being yourself is really the way to be most effective in this process. Planning ahead, giving oneself, plenty of time to breathe and reflect, all good things to keep in mind in the admissions process, to do research, to ask questions, and not to be afraid to reach out to us, things that I would definitely recommend. College admissions people, colleges and universities, we know that you're human, and we absolutely do not expect perfection or robots. And so treat yourself with kindness and generosity, and know that that is important to us and to the process as well. And know that ultimately you will find a place that will be the right match for you and where you will thrive as a young person. Colleges and universities, unfortunately, have very limited space oftentimes and applicant pools that far exceed the number of beds they have on campus or seats they have in classrooms. And so we have to make these granular and nuanced decisions between applications aligned with what we're seeking on our campus communities, but ultimately know that you will find the place that is the right match for you. With that in mind, I'm going to turn off my presentation and welcome any questions that might have come in while I was speaking this evening.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, if anyone has questions, feel free to send them to me at my email. It's jserafine@mcquaid.org. And I'll be happy to answer those right now or in the future. A couple of questions I had, I was hoping maybe you could address, Emily, is maybe can you talk a little bit about the effect that the pandemic has had on college admissions? A couple of things that we saw here last year, and I think have carried over a little bit this year. We had a little bit of an explosion of the number of schools that kids applied to last year, which I think complicated things a little bit. And we had several kids that were on waiting lists. We had more kids on waiting lists, I think, than typical, which I think was the trend nationwide. But could you speak just a little bit about what effect you saw because of the pandemic on college admissions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I appreciate the question. And really I think the story of last year is a reflection of the year before in many ways. So the 2019 to 2020 admission cycle, a lot of institutions found themselves in the spring in the wake of the pandemic. Certainly, I was at another institution other than Bowdoin at the time, and this was our experience, in a uncertain state, in part because we weren't sure what was going to happen in the fall in terms of classes and students coming back to campus. We weren't sure, frankly, what sort of enrollment we were going to see. And I think we had a lot of questions, and a lot of students at many highly selective colleges who were supposed to enter in the fall of 2020 ended up taking a gap year or deferring their, or fall of 2020 2020, yes, sorry. With pandemic, the years sometimes I get tripped up there. Ended up taking gap years or taking time off or doing something in a different way. So then this past year, speaking to colleagues at other colleges and universities as well, many institutions enrolling classes for the fall of 2021 weren't sure how many of those students were going to be coming back or what the gap year situation was going to be like. And so I think the admissions practices have been a little less predictable than we typically saw pre-pandemic, even at and for the most highly selective colleges and universities. And so schools, many schools were a bit conservative and may have waitlisted slightly more students than typical or kept their waitlists longer than they expected because they weren't sure what they would ultimately see in terms of enrollment. I think things have stabilized a little bit. We're in the pandemic, we're sort of in the pandemic for the foreseeable future. And I think there's a better handle on what we might expect in terms of matriculation and enrollment, as well as many institutions. Bowdoin, for example, we have all of our students on campus living in residence halls. We're functionally back to normal, although we do have COVID testing and masking policies at play in various ways. So I think there's a bit of a return to stability from the enrollment management side of things. I think what has happened, though, is some of the changes the pandemic brought about have resulted in increased and different patterns of application behavior, sort of exactly what you were speaking to. Nationally, this past year, the Common App saw increased numbers of applications, specifically at the most selective colleges and universities. And students applied more broadly, probably in part because of the behavior of the prior year, where things seemed a bit unpredictable. But also, I think the adoption of test optional practices probably drove different kinds of application behavior. Some students may have decided to apply to more schools or to, for lack of a better description, throw their hat in the ring at an institution that, if the testing had been required, they may not have applied to, for example. So there has been continued growth, just what I'm hearing from colleagues in other schools and seen on the ground as well, sort of nationally among the most selective schools in our application pools. I think it's still important for students and families to work with schools, so great folks like you, in identifying a good list. And that might include some places that you might call reaches or stretches or whatever terminology is your preference. Some places that might be more, sort of aligned with where a student expects to receive positive news, and sort of a mix of different kinds of institutions. I would really encourage students and families to lean into the suggestions and advice and guidance you're receiving at McQuaid, because you have excellent counselors and resources who know what they're talking about and can really support you and your family through this process in an informed way. That's where I would go for advice on that.
Great, thank you. Could I ask you to speak a little bit about just your stance on early decision versus regular decision versus early action? There's been a preponderance of interest in the earlies, so to speak. Just pros and cons or advice you might want to throw out there to prospective students who are thinking about early decision or early action.
Sure. So just to give a quick primer, I know we may have some younger and high school students, families with us this evening. Early decision is generally, I should say, binding. So students enrolling, if they're admitted, some schools have more than one round of early decision. They may have early decision 1, which typically has a November 1st or November 15th deadline. A student hears back early to mid-December. And then if a student's admitted, he's coming. He said he's coming to that institution. Some schools, Bowdoin's one of them, have early decision 2, which is a second round of early decision. Early January deadlines, typically hearing back in mid-February. So generally speaking. Again, students have committed to coming to that institution if they've been admitted. And then, of course, regular decision, students have a choice to enroll in the spring if they're admitted. Also, some institutions do have early action. Sometimes it's single choice, which means a student can only apply to that institution or other schools as long as they meet certain criteria. Sometimes schools are just early action. No restrictions apply. Early action is generally not binding. So a student hears back early in the process and has a choice whether to enroll or not. Early decision, the binding option, I think can be a great choice for students who know that they really want to be at an institution and that is where they want to enroll. And also for students and families who've done a little bit of the homework in advance to prepare. So a student who is ready earlier in the fall of the senior year to apply, maybe for whom someone that the fall semester grades are less something that they need to make sure an admissions committee can see a full semester of grades in the process. And we can talk about that in a minute. Also to ensure that a school is a good financial fit. So a student and family who have done a little bit of homework around cost and whether a school meets full need or offers merited or all of these important questions. But assuming that a student's in that position and he knows he wants to be at college X and they offer early decision, I think it can be a good choice. Oftentimes the applicant pools, generally speaking, the applicant pools are smaller at early decision versus regular decision. So it's an opportunity for a student to apply and hear back sooner in that smaller pool. I will caution students and families from making the assumption that it's somehow innately easier at the most selective colleges and universities to be admitted early versus regular. Oftentimes, Bowdoin, this is the case. Early decision pools are just as academically deep and broad as regular decision. They're just a smaller pool in the early rounds, though every school is different and sort of varies a little bit on that front. If a student's not sure, if a student, couldn't say definitively they want to be at college X or university Y, or they need more time, or a student needs to compare financial aid awards, or is really hoping to identify merit scholarships in this process, early decision might not be the right fit. Again, this is a place where I would encourage students and families to lean into conversations with the school counselor to get a sense of how early might play a role, but it can be a good option. And certainly there are many colleges and universities that really value when students have made that identification in the process that I really want to be at Bowdoin or WashU or Swarthmore or whatever institution it might be, and that I, the student, have figured out that that's the place for me.
Could you give us a sense just of like your number specifically at Bowdoin, like what percentage of your class, like let's say last year, did you accept early decision?
Yeah, so across our early decision rounds, about half of our enrolling class, which is about 517 students in the first year class this year, about half of those students came through one of our two early rounds. So early decision 1, early decision 2. And so for us, it's, 250 something students came from either early decision 1 or early decision 2. So it gives you an example, and it's going to vary. I would say I've heard in the sort of highly selective college university realm, everything from maybe a quarter of the class, 20% of the class, to there's some highly selective colleges, universities out there that I think in the past have hit almost 70 or 80% of, I think it's 70 is probably the high mark, percent of their class from early decision. I think it's tough because sometimes students and families hear those statistics and they feel immense pressure to select an early decision school as a result. And I think it's a better outcome for students to identify if they have a school already in mind that is the place they really want to be, whether early decision is the right choice, as opposed to deciding early decision is the plan and going in search of the school.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, we saw that here last year, and I was a little bit concerned because there's a lot of publicity around the benefits of applying early decision, and that kids were in a more advantageous position if they applied early decision. And the concern I had was that, at the same time that was happening, that class of kids, and actually this class of kids also, we're kind of forced to look through a limited lens in terms of their search. So while they weren't able to be exposed to as many search opportunities as the typical kid would pre-pandemic, and the other end of the line, we're telling them, hey, early decision may be the best opportunity for you to go. So it's a little bit confusing for kids, I think. But thank you for your words on that. Just lastly, before you go, if you would mind, and I loved your presentation, by the way, I thought it was spot on. Let me ask you the same question I asked Rob Alexander in our earlier presentation. If there was one quality that you look for in an attractive candidate's application, what might that be?
This is a good one. And I will say, I promise I'm not getting out of answering. I will answer. But I think one of the benefits to operating an admissions committee process, like we do at Bowdoin and many highly selective college universities, is that we have multiple views at the table, multiple people involved. So it's never one person and their one thing they're seeking. But I would say something that's important to me and that I value in applicants would be empathy. And I think it comes through in lots of different ways. It can come through in how a student helps a younger sibling. It can come through in how a student is a leader in the classroom. It can come through in sort of what you might imagine is a more traditional way of demonstrating empathy in direct service or in work to make the community a better place. There's lots of different ways that empathy can shine. But I think having an understanding of one's role in the world and the value of being an empathetic person is something that I always notice.
Well, thank you for that. I really appreciate that. And thank you again for your presentation tonight. It's easy to see why Bowdoin's such a spectacular place, and it's filled with people like you. And again, thank you for your expertise. If I could look at the audience that's out there now, I see a lot. I'd probably be able to see a lot of remote controls clicking on the Bills Patriots game. So we will bow out here. Again, thank you so much, Emily. I greatly appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. And thanks to all the students and families here, and know that you're in great hands at McQuaid with wonderful leadership and excellent expertise. And I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you this evening.
Thank you. And to the parents and the students that are out there, again, thank you for joining us tonight. Tomorrow night, we have 3 presentations. The first one beginning at 5:30 tomorrow night, Financial Aid 101. Tommy Ann Russell from St. Lawrence University is presenting on Financial Aid 101. At 6:30, we have the college search process presented by Sydney Clayton from Georgetown University. And at 7:30, we have practical advice for the college-bound student athlete, which is being presented by Tony Rogers from Colgate University. So I hope you can join us again tomorrow night. And again, Emily, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Night all.